I think everybody knows what we're going to hear about today, which is he's going to talk about his very exciting and wonderful new book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which was published in October of this year. I will not give a long introduction. I could spend a long time reading his bio, and I think you'd rather hear from him. But I would like to say a few words about his impact both on the fields of psychology and economics and also on Princeton and the Woodrow Wilson School. There are very few people in the world who are, have such a big impact not only in one discipline but in two, and then manage to bring those disciplines together. Professor Kahneman is a very distinguished psychologist, and I think, as most of you probably know, he also won the Nobel Prize in economics. I think probably the first psychologist to have that honor. And he did that because he has this marvelous way of integrating psychology, taking insights from psychology and bringing them to bear in really interesting ways to many of the issues that people think about and care about. Having psychology in a policy school is unusual. Having one of the very best psychologists in the world teaching in a policy school is just been tremendous for us. So I want to thank him for his contributions to the school and welcome him to the Wilson School today to give this talk. After he gives a talk, we will have a book signing reception. So as soon as his talk is over, we're going to scoot out of here, go into the dining room, and people who want to come in and have their book signed and talk to him are free to do so. So welcome.
Thank you. Well, yeah, that's the one. It's exciting to be here. I've spoken a lot in that room, actually, so it's quite a familiar room. And for some reason, I've also spoken a lot about the book. I've been on a book tour and given that talk many times, and I don't think I've ever been quite as intimidated as I am right now. So I wrote a book. It was a very painful process. I think it was a mistake to start it, and I suffered for many years. Now it's over. And I want to begin by telling you a bit about the history, the personal history behind the book. It actually started a very long time ago when I was in the Israeli army. I spent a year in the infantry as a platoon commander, and then I was in the psychology branch. I had graduated in psychology. So I was 22 years old. And we had an experience that had quite a profound influence on me. One of my occasional duties was to participate in the selection of candidates for officer training school. And we had a lot of different procedures. The one I remember best is one in which people were given a poll, telephone poll. They were in groups of 8, no insignia of ranks or anything, all equal. And we'd bring them to an obstacle, this case says a wall, about 5 or 6 feet tall, 6. And there was a large, like a telephone pole. We'd ask them to lift it, and then we'd give them an instruction. And the instruction was to get over the wall without the pole touching either the ground or the wall, and without anybody touching the wall. Can be done, but it's very difficult. It's hard. It's hot in Israel. It's very hot when you're carrying a telephone pole. It's a leaderless situation, so they've got to sort themselves out. They've got to, as a group, decide how they're going to operate. And the very striking experience was that we would watch those people in action on the field, and we had a compelling impression that we knew their nature. We knew who was going to be a leader and who was not going to be a leader. It was so obvious. There were wimps and there were real, solid people. There were leaders and there were followers. There were really nasty people, and there were some. We had the feeling as we were watching these people under intense stress, and they knew they were being watched, which didn't make things easier for them. We had the feeling we knew them. And we had the feeling very confident feeling that we knew who was going to be a good leader and who was not. That was very compelling. And that experience of knowing people's nature, you know, we all have it, and we all frequently have it. I remember from there, you know, I had it in interviews. I would interview someone, and I still remember and cherish the memory of a fellow, and I had the impression that this person felt he was carrying too much of the load relative to the group. And so I asked him, I remember, do you feel that you are surrounded by lazy people who exploit you? And he said, sir, how did you guess? And I felt that was very diagnostic, and I could tell what sort of a person that was and how he would do under different challenges. Now, the interesting part of the story was that, in fact, we couldn't tell anything at all. All these impressions that we had very confidently, all these powerful intuitions that we had about who was going to be a good leader and who was not, they were put to the test because the people that we did select to go to officer training school did go. And a few months later, we had feedback from the school. And of course, they had observed those cadets for much, much longer than we had. So they knew more about these people than we did. And we could correlate our impressions and our judgments and our ratings with what actually happened to those people 6 months later. And basically, we didn't know a thing. All our impressions were completely invalid. And I remember being enormously impressed by that, because what made this particularly impressive was we used to have those statistics meetings where we would get our feedback on Fridays, and Sunday is a working day in Israel. The Sunday morning, that's the army, a new group of people would come. So we had just heard the statistics that told us that we were completely lacking in any validity for predicting the outcome. And then we took those people to the wall, told them to lift the pole. You know, it's the army. There is a routine. So we had to do that. And then 2 minutes later, we were seeing their natures revealed in absolute detail. The compelling impression that we could tell the nature of these people by looking at them. Well, in fact, we knew the statistics, that we couldn't tell anything that was useful. That really puzzled me. I remember. I was 22 years at the time, and I had a name for it. I called it the illusion of validity. The illusion that the judgments that you make are valid, because it seems to be a feeling that you have. Confidence is a feeling. It is not really a judgment. In terms of judgment, I knew that it was, you know, that what we were doing was useless. But as a feeling, the feeling was there. And that contrast between the feeling of confidence and the knowing that what you're doing is useless, that stayed with me for many years. And about 13 years later, I was a professor at Hebrew University by that time, and I invited a younger colleague to give a talk in a seminar I was teaching. And the topic, the discussion, was about the quality of our statistical intuitions. We're both teaching statistics at the time, and the question was whether the research he described was about the issue of whether people are good intuitive statisticians. Do they have roughly correct intuitions about statistics? And I knew that mine, at any rate, were no good at all. That is, I was teaching statistics, I knew the material, but on matters where I had to make a snap judgment, my snap judgments just did not follow the rules that I knew, and that I knew so well that I could teach them quite well. So we got into a big discussion about this, and we started working together. And that seminar actually changed my life. And I want to show you two pictures of that colleague of mine. His name is Amos Tversky, and he died in 1996. He certainly would have shared the Nobel Prize if he had been alive at the same time. This is what he looked like, you know, in his prime. So you can see a real serious scholar. But that's not the reason I want to show you this picture. I want to show you this picture. And this picture is what he looked like what he looked like when we were doing the work. And that is the picture that represents a lot of how very good work is done. You can feel that somebody is having an enormous amount of fun and wants to shake some trees, and there is something mischievous about him, and that was the nature of the work. Actually, what Amos and I did for a number of years, and the book to a very large extent originates from that. We spent years, we used to spend most of our days together, and we liked each other's company, and we found the work really very funny. He was very funny, and I was funny too. When I was with him, we were laughing all the time. And our subject, which was really quite a serious subject, was to observe and identify situations in which we had powerful intuitions which were false. So that we knew the statistics, but we had an intuition that violated the statistics. And we found a lot of them. It was, in fact, very easy to find cases in which people have a strong feeling and that they know something, which in fact they do not know. So I have remained interested, I have remained interested in the question of intuition ever since, and the marvels and flaws of intuition are really the topic of the book. I spend most of the time on flaws, but in fact, intuition is mostly marvelous, and I hope that in this talk, I'll try to do justice both to the flaws and to the marvels. Intuition is an interesting word, and we have the feeling, I think most of us, that there is some magic to it. You know, I had an intuition that this and that would happen. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a bestseller, Blink, which convinced a lot of people, something that Malcolm Gladwell, I think, doesn't really fully believe himself, but that there is a magic to intuition, that people can know, and that's the expression. It's an interesting expression. People can know without knowing how they know. That's the definition of intuition. But it's sort of interesting, because how do you use the word know? Use the word know. We apply that word only when what you think you know is true. So we are really biased to feel, you really very rarely would say, I had an intuition that this would happen, but it didn't. If you had an intuition, you say that when it did happen. So we are biased in believing in the magic of intuition. We all want to believe this. And so I'll try to tell you what I now think about intuition. I want to distinguish two modes of thinking. And to introduce this is one way that thoughts come to mind, okay? So you know that this lady is angry, right? And you know it as soon as you see her, you know that she's angry. And you know that as quickly as you know that her hair is dark. Furthermore, what you know is not only about the present, you're predicting the future. You have an idea of the kinds of things that she's going to say. You don't know the content, but you know it's not going to be nice. And you have an idea of what her voice will sound like. So that is intuition. This is very quick. You didn't decide to do it. You didn't decide to make a judgment. It just came to you. And that is how intuitions and many other kinds of thoughts come to mind. They just come to you. You don't initiate them. You do not deliberately choose to have them. Now, if I put this on the board, well, probably nothing came to mind, right? It's actually not quite true. Something did come to your mind. You recognize this as a multiplication problem. You probably had an idea of whether, if you tried, you could do it in your head. You knew more than that. You knew that the result is more than 100 and less than 1,000,000. So there is a lot that you knew immediately, but you didn't know the number. To find out and figure out that this is 408, you've got to go through a different kind of thinking. And this thinking is controlled. It's something that you do. It is not something that happens to you. It is something that you initiate. We feel the authors of our thoughts, of these kind of thoughts. They're typically slower, they don't come automatically, and they have the feeling that we generate them. So this is, I call them System 1 thoughts and System 2 thoughts. And if the question arises, I'll explain why I'm using those terms. There's a real problem with them because they're not really systems. But System 1 is the fast one. System 2 is the slow one. System 1 is automatic. System 2 is controlled. And you'll see that will play out a lot. Now, there is another function of System 2, which I want to illustrate. So this is a puzzle. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, let me put some of you out of your misery. It's 5 cents. That's the correct answer. What's interesting about this puzzle is that everybody, or just about everybody, has a thought that comes immediately to mind as soon as you see the puzzle. The answer is 10 cents, and that answer is wrong. Now, that research actually was done about 10 years ago by a fellow who was at the time a postdoc of mine, Shane Frederick, and he collected data at Princeton, among other places, and at Princeton, and Princeton is not worse than Harvard or MIT, about 50% of students get it wrong in a questionnaire. They write 10 cents. Now, you know something really important about the people who write 10 cents. You know that they didn't check themselves. Because if they had checked themselves, then 10 cents and $1.10 is $1.20. So that's not the correct answer. So anybody who tells you 10 cents didn't check, and that's about 50% of Princeton undergraduates. And it's sort of interesting. And let me tell you, Princeton undergraduates are really good. In some universities that I will not name, the percentage of people who get this wrong is about 85%. And that turns out to be quite an important measure. It's a measure of control, of whether you're checking yourself. So System 2 is not only, as I think about it, is not only the system that generates those deliberate and slow thoughts, but it also is a system that monitors behavior. So we don't say everything that comes to mind. We don't do everything that comes to mind. You know, we're controlled. And that is a job of System 2. So those are the two things that it does. Now, I'll tell you about bananas and vomit in a minute. The characteristic of System 2, and it's an important one, is that the capacity to exert effort, System 2 is basically an effortful system. So it takes work to monitor yourself, actually. It doesn't take a lot of work, but it takes some work. It takes work to generate thoughts deliberately, according to a plan. So System 2 is effortful. And how do we know about effort? Well, we know because there are physiological signs of effort. For example, the pupil of the eye dilates whenever you think a little harder. Heart rate tends to increase, blood pressure, but the pupil happens to be the best. It's the one that I studied many years ago. And what is interesting about effort is that when you're busy, when you're doing one thing, you cannot do other things. There is a limited capacity for effort. So you cannot, or very few people can, even those who can compute 17 times 24 in their head, they cannot do it while they're making a left turn into traffic. And nobody should try. And the point about this is that those two, making a left turn into traffic, unlike driving on an empty road, making a left turn into traffic, you've got to concentrate. And if you concentrate on that one thing, you just don't have the capacity to do other things at the same time. So that's the characteristic of system 2. It's a limited capacity system, and it's basically concerned with the allocation of attention. And the allocation of attention turns out to be critical to self-control and to a lot of intelligent performance, and there is a lot we know about it. So, now, the hero of my story is not system 2. The hero of my story is system 1, because it generates intuitions, and that's the one that I mostly want to talk about. And now, here we're back to this one. Now, we know a lot about what happens to people in the first second or two when they see this, and I'll just make a list of the things that we know. So, you didn't like it. You had images and memories, and most of them were unpleasant. You made a disgust face, it was visible. Then there is something that you almost certainly did not notice that you did. You flinched, because we know from a lot of experiments, people are shown a word like vomit, and they pulled back. So a lot happens, and it happens immediately. It happens, there's nothing deliberate about it. This is the part of the reaction to that stimulus. What's interesting about those responses is they tend to reinforce each other. So what happens when you're presented with, say, the word vomit alone, and I'll bring in the bananas in a minute, but when you're presented with that one word, you make a disgust face and you feel disgust, but we also know that making a disgust face by itself causes you to feel disgust. There are many beautiful experiments doing that, and it's not all about disgust. For example, it's about finding things that are funny. So you take a pencil and you put it in your mouth like this, and then you show people cartoons when they're holding a pencil like this, and they find them funny. Funnier than usual. And that's because when you have a pencil like this in your mouth, you smile. I mean, it's just the physical movements of smiling. You stick the pencil this way, makes you frown. The cartoons are much less funny than usual. So that's an effect of how your body works on the emotions. And the emotions, of course, produce the bodily responses. And in general, that is a characteristic of system 1 thoughts and of the system 1 reaction. It produces a coherent response. And all of it is in what we call associative memory. I'm not going to use a lot of jargon, but here is, ideas are linked to each other. And ideas, I mean very broadly, including making a smiling face or a disgust face. They're all links. And those links tend to activate each other, to facilitate each other. And those are some of the outcomes. Now, let me bring in the banana. Most people will link the banana to the vomit. There is really no reason, but there is something that people immediately tend to do. They tend to generate a causal story. That is, there are those two stimuli, there is one on the left, one on the right, one thing apparently happened before the other, and a cause is inferred. And we really know that people continuously, as we go through life, without deliberately searching for causes, we're generating causal stories. We're explaining the world as we live it continuously. And that is a function of system 1. So it's actually quite sophisticated that way. Now, the coherence has some strange manifestations that psychologists, let me remove this one. It has manifestations that psychologists have been studying. And one of the first demonstrations, which is still one of the best, is you show people, you ask people to make up sentences from a set of words. And so one set of words might include Florida, wrinkles, and you know, gray, or bald. I mean, you get the general idea. you never mention old age, but all these words are associatively related to old age. And that's part one of the experiment, and then, they're excused from that experiment, and they're asked to go to another experiment at the other end of the hall. And the variable that is measured is how long it takes them to get there, compared to people who had a different set of 5 words. People who have been exposed to 5 words related to old age walk more slowly to the experiment, on average. Completely unconscious of it. But this is modern psychology. I mean, these are among the exciting results of modern psychology. And they demonstrate that continuously we are under the influence of stimuli that we may not even be aware of, and that have a very significant effect on our behavior. I'll show you another. How do you read this? Well, ABC, of course. And this is read 12, 13, 14. But the center of both of these is identical. It's exactly the same thing. So in a context of letters, you don't have to decide to read that as a B. You just read it as a B. And that is interesting for an important reason. We are not aware of the ambiguity. This is the way System 1 works. It resolves ambiguities, and we're not aware of them. You can tell people, a sentence like, she approached the bank. And most people will understand bank, as a place with vaults and money. But in the context of, rowing on a river, she approached the bank means something entirely different. And you're not aware that the word bank is ambiguous. She approached the bank could mean either. We go by, in this case, the more frequent interpretation. So for people who are, on the river all the time, they might think of the river. But for most of us, it's a bank. Now, let me show you this experiment. I had a bad experience today of an experiment that I believed in, and that turned out to be wrong. So I'm praying that this experiment is not wrong. Here it is. This was done in a British university, in a biology department. And like many places in British universities, they have a room where you can drink coffee and biscuits. And you can go and help yourself to coffee, biscuits, some milk. And there is an honesty box. And you contribute to that honesty box. And the experiment consisted of putting a poster right above the honesty box. And it goes from bottom to top, so they alternated the poster every week. So the first week you had those 2 huge eyes. That's how much people contributed. The next week they had flowers. And you can see that the contributions plummet. Then they have eyes again, then flowers, then eyes, then flowers. Nobody was ever aware that this was happening, that an experiment was being conducted. But being watched is associatively related to being supervised, and that is related to behaving well. And you generate good behavior in this way. Now, again, what is important and remarkable, I think, about this is that people are completely unaware. This changes, I think, the image of what we're like, or what life is like, because we tend to identify with our system too. We think, this is what we're aware of. We're aware of the thoughts that we generate. We're aware of the things we do voluntarily. We're very barely aware of other things that we do, and very often we're not aware of the process that generated them. And this is what this experiment is about. So, let me tell you a few things about the marvels of intuition. We all know, we have all heard those stories, and they're true stories about the physician who just has a glimpse at a patient and has a complex diagnosis. One of my favorite stories is by Gary Klein, a psychologist who is he likes intuition and trusts intuition much more than I do, but he had that very fine story of a commander of a firefighting unit, and they are, I think, in a kitchen, and they're working to identify the source of the fire, and suddenly he hears himself shout, "Let's get the hell out of here." And they do, and the house explodes. And it turns out he didn't know why he said that, so it was knowing without knowing how he knew. But his feet were hot, and his ears were hot, hotter than usual, and the fire was directly underneath them, and only later did he figure it out. So that is the way that intuition works. And that sounds almost like a miracle, except that it's not a miracle. So in the first place, we all know that chess masters can achieve that, and we think that's a miracle. But that's not true. It's not a miracle either, because if you have a child, a 2-year-old child, who points at something and says "doggy," that child has no idea of how she came to that conclusion, that this is a dog. Just happened. It happens to her. This is the way intuition works. Intuition is mostly recognition. It is recognizing patterns. And unless you have been exposed to enough patterns to know how to recognize them, you are going to fail. And that explains some of my early experiences. We have very good intuitions about what's going to happen next in a conversation. We have very good intuitions about what immediately follows. We're very good at other things. I and anybody else here who is married I can tell my wife's mood from one word on the telephone. And that takes a lot of practice, but we all get that practice. So the point is, there is absolutely no magic to intuition. Intuition is recognition, and you are going to acquire it if the conditions for learning to pair things are satisfied. And that requires a world that is sufficiently regular so that you get reinforcement, you get rewarded for guessing it right. And it also requires immediate feedback. So there are professions where no intuition ever develops. For example, pundits who try to make long-term historical predictions. They can't do it. They can't do it better than the average reader of the New York Times. They feel much more confident. They can't do it. Stock pickers on Wall Street, they think they can pick stocks. They're convinced they can pick stocks. They can't do it. And it's not their fault that they can't do it. It's because there are no rules. The world is long term. The world is not predictable. And moderate term, stock prices are not predictable. So somebody cannot learn and intuitions cannot develop. If the world is sufficiently regular and people have the opportunity, they will develop intuitions. And that, I think, is the major story. But as we'll see later, people think they have intuitions even when they don't. Now, about the marvels of intuition and associative thinking and system one, here is the story that impresses me most. It's an experiment where people hear sentences, and they hear a sentence spoken by what is very clearly an upper-class British voice, male. And I'm not going to try to imitate that. And And that voice says, I have large tattoos all down my back. And at the same time, brain events are recorded. And within approximately 3/10 of a second, there is a characteristic response in the brain, surprise. An incongruity has been detected. And if you stop to think about this, this is barely credible. You have to recognize within that 1/3 of a second, the world knowledge that is brought to bear is very, very impressive, because you have to recognize this is a male British upper class voice. You have to bring up a stereotype of upper class British males. That stereotype does not include having large tattoos down their back. Incongruity, a surprise, is the immediate response. So our associative system is extraordinary, both in accumulating world knowledge and in bringing it to bear in real time on situations in an extraordinarily impressive and accurate way. Another feature of the system is how quickly it gets updated. And here I have an anecdote, personal experience. My wife and I were in Australia on an island, Lizard Island, beautiful resort. There are 40 rooms in the island, so it's a very small resort. And so we get there and we go to dinner, and there we meet a colleague a psychologist from Stanford. And, we exclaim, it's a big coincidence, we're all surprised and so on. 2 weeks later, we're in London, in the theater, and the lights go dark, somebody comes and sits next to me, then the lights come up, same guy. Now, the thing that I want to point out was that I was less surprised the second time than the first. And think about it. It had, John, that's the guy I meet all the time. It doesn't take very long to form a rule or a tentative rule or an expectation. 2 examples will do it. The second example retrieves the first. 2 examples are a generalization. And this really is the way it works, so that we have a system that updates with tremendous speed and operates extremely well, and in general is very well attuned to reality. So intuition is marvelous. But it's also flawed. So what I've described so far is expertise, experts of intuition, and we're all experts, and I'm an expert on my wife's tone of voice, and mood. But what happens when there is no expertise? And that is, I think, important. What happens when there is no expertise and we're asked a question? So there are some questions that nothing comes to mind. Like 17, 10, 24, nothing comes to mind. But there are many other questions where something comes to mind immediately. And let me give you an example. I'm going to describe a young woman, Julie. She is a graduating senior at a university. And I'm going to tell you one fact about Julie. And that fact is that she read fluently when she was 4 years old. What is her GPA? Now, what is striking about this is that all of you had a GPA in mind, roughly. And, we know a lot about what GPA that was. 3.2 is too low. 3.9 is probably too high. There is remarkable agreement on that answer. Now, we know how it's generated, and let me tell you how it's generated. When you hear that Julie read fluently at age 4, you immediately have an impression of what I will call intensity, of how precocious that is. You know, how powerful a signal it is of something, in this case of intelligence, say. Now, one feature of System 1 is that we can match across intensity variables regardless of what they are. So I can now ask you, you know, what temperature in the winter in Princeton will be as cold as Julie was precocious? And you'll have an idea of the temperature. And you do. It's not, you know, what income for a professor is about as high as Julie was precocious. You can answer any question because those are intensity variables, and we're able to match intensity variables. We do it by frequency distribution, how rare it is to read at age 4, and we do it in other ways. We can match the intensity of lights to the intensity of sounds. We can match the intensity of punishments to the intensity of crimes, and that, by the way, has a lot to do with the workings of the criminal system. We can match. Now, what GPA came to mind? It came to mind through a process of matching. That is, the GPA that comes to mind is a GPA that is about as impressive as reading at age 4. Now, anybody here who knows any statistics, this is a ridiculous way to make predictions, because the information is worth very little. You should not, predict by matching. But people intuitively predict by matching. And the big rule here, the important rule here, is that people jump to conclusions by answering the wrong question. So I asked a question about Julie's GPA, and the thought that came to mind was a GPA. But in fact, the question that you answered was, how impressive is the fact that she's read at age 4? It is not the same question. And that's the way intuitions come to mind. When the answer to the real question doesn't come to mind, then an answer to a related question will come to mind, and in general, we will not be aware of it. This is a principle of substitution. And we answer the wrong question most of the time. That is, many of the questions that we think about are very, very complicated. I ask you, how happy are you? That requires a computation. What do you think President Obama's popularity will be 6 months from now? Those are lots of questions that, you could spend a long time figuring out an answer. In fact, people are not stumped. That's the remarkable observation about System 1, is that it is not stumped. It comes up with an answer. And the answer is not completely unrelated to the question. There is a relation. But it comes from matching, it comes much too fast, and it ignores, in particular, it ignores everything that you don't know. That is, what the mind is good at, what System 1 does, it takes the information available and it makes the best of it. So it generates a story. So it can be banana vomit, or it can be match precocity in reading to the GPA of a senior. And you're not aware that this is being done, but a coherent story is being generated. And this is what System 1 tends to do. So here is another example. During a period when there was a lot of terrorism activity in the United States, like in Europe about 20 years ago, an experiment was done asking people how much they were willing to pay for insurance. And some people were asked, how much would you pay for insurance that paid $1,000 in case of death for any reason? Okay? And other people are asked, how much would you pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case of death in a terror incident? Can you guess the result? People are willing to pay much more for the second than for the first. And now, how did this happen? Well, you have really no idea how much you want to pay for the insurance. There's one thing, there's a cue that you do have, which is how frightened you are. And people are more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than they're afraid of dying. And that's all it takes. So and you know, one could go on with examples like this for a very long time because there are very many. This is the reason we can answer questions so quickly. This is the reason that we have intuitions about almost anything that people ask us. So, I'm getting there. We'll soon conclude. I want to go back to confidence. I want to go back to the illusion of validity. What was it? What was happening? Well, it turns out that the confidence we have in judgments that we make is really not a judgment of the quality of the information or of the quality of our reasoning. The confidence we have is related to the quality of the story that we can generate. If there is a coherent story, we have high confidence. If the story is inconsistent or there are problems in the evidence, we have low confidence. So confidence is about coherence. And it's a feeling. It is not a judgment. And so what we had, as we were watching those people in the obstacle field, we were telling a story. And we were constructing a story that was beautifully coherent because the behavior of the people in that episode was pretty coherent and consistent. And that's all we needed to generate a prediction of how well they would do in officer training school or in combat. Nonsense, you know, completely unjustified. But that is the way that confidence works. And that is the reason that people tend to be, what did I do here? Okay. So, and that's the reason that people tend to be overconfident. And overconfidence is one of the major findings in current research. Overconfidence, optimism, a lot of the decisions are fed by overconfidence. And they come from our storytelling abilities. System 1 is specialized for telling coherent stories, and success in telling stories induces confidence. I think I have time to tell you a story. And so I will tell you a personal story which will sort of illustrate, to my mind, some of the complexities of these issues. It's a personal story again. And this is about, very long time ago, actually. I was in Israel still and already studying judgment under uncertainty, and I had the idea of getting a curriculum for high schools on judgment and decision-making that would not involve mathematics. An idea. So we got support from the Ministry of Education, and I assembled a team, and we worked for about a year. And, you know, we were doing pretty well. We had teachers in the team and psychologists, and the dean of the School of Education at Hebrew University was also there, a member. He was an expert on curriculum development. And on one particular Friday, and I don't really know how that happened, I had the thought of doing a forecasting exercise. So I asked the people the following question: how long will it take us to complete the book? And by that I mean to hand in a draft to the Ministry of Education so that it's very well defined. And I did it right. When you want people to do something like that, you should never have a discussion. You should ask them to fill a slip of paper individually and then to collect the answers. So we had all the answers. I wrote my own slip, and all of us were between 18 months, a year and a half, and 2.5 years. That was pretty clear. Then I turned to Seymour, who was the dean of the School of Education, and I asked him if he knew other teams that were doing the same thing, that had done the same thing we were doing, that is, develop a curriculum where no curriculum existed before. And he said he did. And so I said, do you know enough about them so that you could see where they were when they were roughly at the same stage of progress that we are at now? And he said he could. And then I said, well, that's beautiful. Now, well, what happened to them? And then he hesitated for a while. I'm pretty sure he did. It's a story I've told many times, so I remember the story more than the actual event. But in my story, he blushed. And he said something really interesting. He said, well, you know, not all of them actually wrote a book. Like about 40% of them gave up. That had never occurred to us. I mean, it honestly had never, the possibility of failure hadn't come to our mind. So by then, anxiety was rising slightly, and we said, yeah, how long did it take for those who did write a book? And he said, well, I can't think of any who finished in less than 7 years. and I can't think of any who lasted more than 10, so somewhere between 7 and 10. Now, what's interesting about this is that Seymour, his judgment had been, I don't know, well within the range, like 2 years. So he had all the information in his head to do the statistics, but he hadn't used that information. He had used information that was about us. Other people doesn't seem equally relevant. And that, I call that the distinction between the inside view of a problem, thinking about it from the inside, and the outside view, looking at the statistics. Turns out there is a huge difference. And it turns out that we tend to take the inside view, even when the outside view would tell us, as it did in this case, that we're not even close to the ballpark. Now, you may be curious about what happened. What happened, I left Israel a short time thereafter, so I wasn't party to what happened. It took them 8 years. They did finish the book. It was a complete waste of time, and nobody ever used it. But, and don't take that success, too seriously. That's a fluke that it was 8 years and that. But the point is a serious one. There is a difference between the way we intuitively tend to think about problems and the way we might be able to train ourselves to think about problems if we train ourselves to slow down. Slow down, bring to bear statistics, take the outside view. So that's a rule that can improve your thinking. Now, let me mention something else, because so far I look pretty good in this story. I had the idea, I asked Seymour, I had inside view, outside view, pretty clever. Actually, I was an idiot. And this is something that, I can talk about this, and I have for many times, and nobody ever points out, why on earth did you continue? I mean, it was obvious when we heard him that, this wasn't going to work. None of us was prepared to wait 7 years with a 40% chance of failure to go on meeting every Friday and to put in work. It was an investment we were not prepared to make. And we had received information that I think I believed. If I had been sensible, I would have stopped immediately. We should have quit. We didn't quit. And we didn't quit for a reason. The reason is that we were all aware that we were doing pretty well. And that story about the other teams, that's other teams. It's not us. It doesn't have the immediacy of what gives us the feeling that we can do it. This is system one. This is system two. It's very difficult to invoke system two. Now, the idiocy in what I did in allowing the project to go on, it's particularly funny because we were planning to teach rationality. I mean, that was, that was our project. But I can tell you, before you ask me that question, I've been studying intuition for 45 years. 40, depending on how you count, 55 years in another way of counting. And my intuitions have not improved. So if anything is going to improve, it's going to be through system 2. It's that on some occasions, you have to slow yourself down and think differently. But what comes to mind automatically is sometimes marvelous, sometimes flawed, and always automatic. And you have no control over it. Thank you.